Well, hello everyone. It's Dr. Green. I wanted to just go over go over the first lecture of the course with you guys, just to make as an introduction to research. So, a lot of people have their own conceptions actually about research, and I think people really kind of find research to be something that might be out of reach, right? Might potentially be overly boring, overly complex, right? Or even something that really has no value for us as a society. I think the first time that many of us are exposed to research, we generally have those types of ideas, and it seems like something that's really out of reach. But you know, research actually is something that is becoming obviously more and more commonplace in the workforce today. Obviously, this is becoming a necessary skill. Every single employer and every place where I've been hired in the past has asked me or asked employees to do or be able to conduct some sort of research study, either formally or informally in the past. So clearly, this is a necessary skill that's used in the corporate world, oftentimes to promote cost savings or to figure out new processes and procedures for certain things, right? So definitely something that's becoming more commonplace for all of us who work, and I'm sure all of you, whether or not you work in the corporate world, or whether or not you choose to, obviously continue on and pursue a career in exercise science or in healthcare, you will be exposed to this, right? So consumers do research, right, prior to making a purchase. Many people often will conduct informal searches about products or about companies prior to making, purchases for products. Generally speaking, people tend to, utilize biases or utilize, other types of non-scientific processes, often when researching, certain purchases, companies, or items for making purchases. But there are some, like I actually conducted a little bit of a lit review, of the literature prior to buying a pair of barefoot trail hiking shoes, right? I really wanted to, I was making an investment in this pair of shoes, and I wanted to make sure that I had the right data to be able to make an informed purchase, right? So, before spending more than over $100 for a pair of shoes, I wanted to make sure that I understood the research regarding what I was going to be purchasing and how it was going to impact my life, right? And I think that, many of us obviously are familiar with, medical research, and all of us, benefit within the healthcare system from research that's been done. And often now has been, kind of transitioned even out of traditional medical centers, and even out of, laboratory settings into allied health settings, and so we do, research all the time, at the point of care, even in public health type settings, with an athletic training, which is my profession. I'm an athletic trainer by education and background. So, research within allied health in more of an applied science is becoming a lot more common. So research permeates everything that we do, right? So regardless of what we may think of it, it's something that we're going to have to become familiar with to a certain extent. Okay, so clearly all of us at some point, we're either consumers of research, right, or producers of research. And it's up to us, particularly if we are consumers of research, to be able to evaluate data for its quality, right, to be able to evaluate what it is that we're reading, what we're doing, for the quality of that research and the quality of the data that is contained there. Okay. Those of us, though, however, that potentially are students or faculty members or even scientists that are producing research, okay, we have the responsibility to follow, scientific norms and accepted norms and standards when producing research, right? And so making sure that there are no threats to validity, making sure that the question that we're proposing and the project that we are going to be completing has some sort of an effect on the world at large, right? Hopefully a positive one, and that the methods that are utilized to execute that project follow, a scientific format. So regardless of whether we're consuming that research to make a decision or whether we're producing that research, we are consistently utilizing research daily to assist in making those decisions, right? So no matter what we do, no matter what we do, we're either a consumer or a producer. So research defined, right, is a way to gather information and make sound decisions or judgments to develop new knowledge. Okay, so one way that this has been done, and one kind of way to understand this, it's actually very common, is many times we take knowledge that has existed previously in sciences like biology or chemistry or anatomy, right? So on and so forth. And based on what is known in those fields, we develop projects that have a broader application to the outside world. Okay. In medicine or in healthcare, we call that going from bench to bedside, right? So we take our bench research or our laboratory research, and the attempt and the effort is to always try to translate that to the bedside of the patient, right? Another way to think about that could be lab to life, right? So basic science to applied science. For example, looking at the anatomy of the shoulder, for example, right? And how the glenoid labrum, and we know quite a bit about that structure in the shoulder, how with changes that occur, with mechanics of overhead athletes and the more that they throw throughout the year and participate in those activities, they develop anatomical adaptations in the shoulder that can predispose them to injury, right? And so that's one example of how my discipline has adopted bench science and actually brought a project into fruition out in the world as an applied science. So obviously, anytime that we are conducting research, okay, we want to utilize the scientific method. All right. And all of those things, right, all of those things require us to follow these 6 steps and do so in a responsible and thoughtful manner, right? So we have to be able to ask a question, right? We have to be able to ask a scientific question, based on evidence that we read. Okay. And in collecting that evidence, we're doing background research, okay, to be able to determine, what it is that the literature says about a topic, to help us to continue to formulate that question. Once we formulated a question, we can then make an inference, right, or an educated guess about what will happen in a given scenario based on what we know, right? And that's called formulating a hypothesis. Okay. And obviously, we then conduct our study and we test our hypotheses, and analyze our data utilizing statistics. And that's the portion of this course that Dr. Otto will be covering with you on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and really getting into to testing that hypothesis, acceptance, rejection, and data analysis. And obviously, based on the results of this study that we've conducted utilizing the scientific method, we then can draw conclusions about what this study means for us, obviously, at face value, right, in the study. But then we can also essentially make some inferences on what this could mean for society or for people at large, right? Doing that, we're trying to essentially establish what's called external validity. And we'll talk more about that later on in the course. But the scientific method, when it's utilized responsibly, operates via facts first. Okay. A fact is something that is generally observed to be true over time, right? So fact, and ultimately those facts, when they are essentially observed as a whole, right, we can then develop a theory based on a collection of facts about a certain problem, or potentially about how the world works. Now, for example, based on obviously collection of facts and theories, we then develop principles. Okay, an example of that is the principle of diffusion, right, in science. So if we put a solid or a solute in water, okay, as long as there is no membrane through which it has to pass, that the principle of diffusion takes effect. That solid will diffuse until it's equally distributed throughout that solution, right? And so that is a principle that we have put together based on facts that were observed and theories to lead us to a scientific principle. Okay, so obviously, as we're continuing to look at research, we're obviously formulating an appropriate question. We're considering variables. We're going to talk more about what variables are in this class, right? Whether those are the variables that we manipulate for the outcome, or whether those are the variables that we leave alone to see how they are affected, right? And obviously, a big concern is we want to essentially preserve our research from any threats to validity, right? We want to be able to make sure that we're measuring what we say we're going to measure, right? And that there are not things that could come in and confound the results. Okay, and that's called internal validity. We'll talk more about that in this course as well. But in a perfect world, right, we should be able to take the results of our study and transfer them to society at large, right? Transfer them out to the world, and that's called external validity. Every single study has a measure, and it may be very small, or it may be larger, has a level of external validity to it. Generally speaking, right, the higher that a study's internal validity is, the lower the external validity. But in order for research, right, to make an impact on society, not only does it have to have an adequate amount of external validity and be applicable to people, right, but at the very same time, that same question and that same project should be reproduced again, so that that scientific principle then becomes widely known to be true and accepted amongst the scientific community. And that's called reproducibility. So we want to have reproducibility in our data and in our projects, right? It's extremely important. Variables. This is my favorite movie, one of my favorite movies in the world, Dumb and Dumber. I'm a big kid sometimes, but variables, right? So variables are the building blocks of a research question, right? And so it can, really differentiate the members of a group or a set. Variables are essentially, kind of categorized in different ways, right? And variables can often have more than one value. Okay, so we'll talk more about variables as well as we go throughout the course. Now, validity, right? We just kind of mentioned that. So typically as external validity, so the ability to reproduce something in the world and have an impact, right? The higher the external validity we have in a study, typically the lower the internal validity, the lower the level of internal control inside of a study, right? But that also works the other way around. Okay, in the event that we have a study that has a very high level of internal validity, and these are typically going to be our laboratory studies. So laboratory studies are very, very tightly controlled, right? And for that very reason, because they use very, very rigid methodology, and they use very predictable measurements and equipment, they have high levels of internal validity. Okay, now here's the difficulty. Often in science, we see laboratory experiments and those types of things done on animals, right? Clearly, though, animals, or those things that exist within a lab that are the subject of experiments, are not people, right? They are not living in an uncontrolled environment, right? So ultimately, those results from studies that have high internal validity should be extrapolated with caution, right? We should seek to understand and seek to know that because those studies were performed in laboratory settings with tight controls, that they may not be as applicable to the outside world as we would like. It's not always the case, but very often is. Okay. Well, guys, that is just a quick introduction to the class. Okay, and I wanted to put this out here for you. So the course introduction that's posted on Moodle and this PowerPoint in this lecture covers both Tuesday and Thursday. So the next available content will be provided next Tuesday, and that's when we'll move on in the course. Okay, so this material that's posted now will cover Tuesday and Thursday. Hope you guys are having a great Labor Day. Hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to talking with you guys next week. Have a good weekend.